The house on Franklin Avenue stood silent under the January moon, its stone facade glowing pale against the winter darkness. Inside, the heating system hummed its mechanical lullaby, radiating warmth through empty hallways where shadows pooled in corners and stretched across hardwood floors. The clocks on the mantelpiece ticked in syncopation, marking seconds that passed unremarkably, ordinarily, in a neighborhood where manicured lawns slept beneath frost, and security lights cast amber halos onto quiet streets. River Forest, Illinois, a place where doctors and bankers raised children behind brick walls and iron gates, where autumn leaves were raked into precise piles and Christmas lights strung with suburban precision. A sanctuary of order, prosperity, and the illusion of safety. But on this night, in the pre-dawn hours of January 6, 1978, that illusion would shatter like glass beneath a crowbar, and the consequences would ripple outward with the force of an earthquake, leaving bodies in its wake and fear soaked into the concrete of Chicago's underworld. The burglars moved with practiced efficiency, their breath misting in the frozen air as they worked the lock mechanism, feeling for the tumbler's resistance, listening for the click that would grant them access to what they believed was just another score. One of them, a thief named John Mendell, had built a reputation over years of careful heists, jewelry stores, and wealthy homes, each job executed with surgical precision. He led a crew that understood risk and reward, men who calculated odds before they acted. But tonight, in their assessment of vulnerability, in their cataloging of potential profit against probable danger, they had made a miscalculation so catastrophic that it would cost them everything. They had no way of knowing that the door they were opening led not into an ordinary home, but into the private domain of a man who had shaped organized crime in America for half a century. They could not have understood that every item they touched, every drawer they rifled, every possession they disturbed belonged to someone whose name alone could empty rooms and silence conversations. Anthony Joseph Accardo, the man they called Joe Batters, the architect of Chicago's most enduring criminal empire. And though he was 3,000 miles away, enjoying the California sun with his wife, his reach extended far beyond his physical presence. The house might have been empty, but his authority filled every room, invisible yet absolute. When they finally breached the entrance and stepped inside, when their flashlights swept across polished furniture and family photographs, when they began sorting through jewelry boxes and examining silverware, they were committing an act that transcended mere burglary. They were issuing a challenge to a power structure built on fear, loyalty, and the unspoken understanding that certain men, certain names, remained untouchable, regardless of their retirement, their age, or their distance from the daily operations of organized crime. The phone call came just after dawn. Tony Accardo stood on the balcony of his California rental, watching seagulls wheel against a cloudless sky, the Pacific stretching to the horizon in endless blue. His wife was inside, preparing breakfast, and the morning had promised nothing more than another leisurely day far from Chicago's brutal winter. Then the phone rang, and when he answered, the voice on the other end delivered news in terse, controlled sentences. His home had been violated. The place where his children had grown up, where family dinners had been served and grandchildren had played, had been ransacked by thieves who either didn't know or didn't care about the identity of the homeowner. Accardo listened without interrupting, his expression unchanging. Decades of discipline keeping his emotions locked behind a mask of calm. When he finally spoke, his words were measured, almost quiet. But those who knew him understood that volume had never been his instrument of power. It was the certainty in his voice, the absolute conviction that consequences would follow, that made men tremble. He made several more calls that morning, each one brief, each one conveying instructions that would set machinery into motion across the Midwest. By noon, every lieutenant in the Chicago outfit had been notified. By evening, informants were being contacted, Surveillance was being organized, and names were being compiled in notebooks and memorized in minds that never forgot a debt or a slight. The message cascading through the criminal underworld was unmistakable. Someone had crossed a line that should never have been approached, let alone breached, and the reckoning would be thorough, methodical, and absolutely merciless. To understand the magnitude of what those burglars had done, to comprehend why their act would trigger a wave of violence unprecedented even in Chicago's blood-soaked history, one must first understand the man they had wronged. Anthony Accardo had been born in April of 1906 in the heart of Chicago's Little Italy, a neighborhood where Italian immigrants carved out lives from sweat and ambition, where opportunity and organized crime occupied the same narrow streets. His childhood was shaped by poverty and pragmatism, and by the time he reached adolescence, he had already learned that survival required more than honest labor. It required cunning, connections, and the willingness to operate outside the boundaries of conventional morality. In the 1920s, when Prohibition transformed America into a bootlegger's paradise, and Chicago became the epicenter of organized crime, young Tony found himself drawn into the orbit of the most notorious gangster in American history, Al Capone. The name alone conjured images of violence and excess, of Tommy guns and St. Valentine's Day massacres, of a criminal empire that generated millions of dollars annually while bodies piled up in alleys and rivals disappeared into the Chicago River. Accardo became a bodyguard, a driver, an enforcer who earned the nickname Joe Batters after demonstrating his willingness to use a baseball bat to extract information or administer punishment. But unlike many of Capone's foot soldiers, who relied on brute force and lacked the intelligence to rise beyond muscle work, Accardo possessed something rarer, a strategic mind, an ability to see patterns, to anticipate consequences, to understand that real power wasn't wielded through flamboyant displays of violence, but through careful manipulation of fear, loyalty, and economic leverage. When Capone's empire crumbled under federal prosecution and tax evasion charges, when lesser men scrambled for control and the Chicago outfit fragmented into warring factions, Accardo survived by being smarter, more patient, and infinitely more calculating than his competitors. He understood that the era of flashy gangsters and newspaper headlines was ending, that modern organized crime required discretion, political connections, and the appearance of legitimacy masking illegal operations. He helped build a new structure for the outfit, one that diversified beyond bootlegging into gambling, labor racketeering, loan sharking, and political corruption. He cultivated relationships with union leaders, judges, and politicians, creating a web of influence that made the outfit nearly untouchable. And he did it all while maintaining a profile so low that most Chicagoans wouldn't have recognized him on the street. By the 1940s, Accardo had become the de facto leader of the Chicago outfit, though he preferred to operate through intermediaries and figurehead bosses who could absorb public scrutiny while he orchestrated operations from the shadows. He married, raised a family, and presented himself as a successful businessman with legitimate investments in real estate and entertainment. He moved to River Forest, into a mansion that reflected his wealth without announcing his criminal pedigree. And he lived alongside lawyers and executives who either didn't know or chose not to acknowledge what he really was. His reign lasted decades, an extraordinary feat in a profession where leadership typically ended in assassination or imprisonment. He avoided both, not through luck, but through meticulous planning and an almost supernatural ability to anticipate threats. He never carried a gun in his later years. He rarely raised his voice. His power was psychological, rooted in the understanding that he could order someone's death with a whisper, and that order would be executed without question, without hesitation, without any trace leading back to him. By the mid-1970s, Accardo had officially retired, passing day-to-day control to younger men while maintaining his position as an elder statesman whose approval was still required for major decisions. He was in his 70s, a grandfather, a man who attended family gatherings and took vacations with his wife. To casual observers, he had left his criminal past behind. But in the world of organized crime, retirement is a fiction. Power doesn't evaporate with age, it evolves. And Accardo's power in 1978 remained absolute, enforced not through his physical presence, but through the infrastructure he had built, the loyalties he had cultivated, and the fear he had instilled over 50 years of ruthless leadership. This was the man whose home had been burglarized. This was the legacy that had been disrespected. And this was the force that would now be unleashed upon those foolish enough to believe that an old man's retirement meant vulnerability. The burglary crew had worked quickly, professionally. They knew that speed was essential, that every minute inside the house increased the risk of discovery. They had targeted jewelry, cash, and small valuables that could be fenced easily, items that wouldn't be traced or require elaborate disposal networks. In their assessment, it was a clean job, well executed, with minimal risk of identification. John Mendell had led the operation, bringing in trusted associates, including a skilled thief named Bernard Ryan, known as Buddy to his criminal circle, and Stephen Garcia, a burglar whose reputation for finesse and nerve had earned him respect in Chicago's underworld. These were not amateur criminals. They were professionals who understood the game, who had pulled off dozens of successful heists without attracting serious law enforcement attention. But they had violated the cardinal rule of Chicago crime. They had failed to verify ownership. They had neglected to determine whether the house belonged to someone connected, someone protected, someone whose retaliation would be swift and total. In their defense, Accardo's name was not prominently associated with the Franklin Avenue address. He had purchased the property years earlier under arrangements that obscured direct ownership. His neighbors knew him as a quiet, elderly man who kept to himself. There were no obvious markers of mob affiliation, no armed guards patrolling the perimeter, no signs warning potential intruders of the danger they faced. The house looked like any other wealthy residence in River Forest, which was precisely how Accardo wanted it. But within hours of the discovery, within the time it took for a housekeeper to arrive and find drawers open and valuables missing, the machinery of identification began. Law enforcement was notified, not because Accardo expected police assistance, but because maintaining appearances required normal procedures. Officers arrived, took statements, dusted for fingerprints, and filed reports that would ultimately go nowhere. The real investigation was happening through entirely different channels. Outfit associates began making inquiries, leaning on informants, pressuring fences who might have been approached about selling stolen goods, and tracing the pattern of recent burglaries in the area. The criminal community had its own intelligence network, often more effective than official law enforcement, and within that network, information flowed quickly when someone as powerful as Accardo demanded answers. The names began to surface within days: John Mendell, Buddy Ryan, Steve Garcia. Men who operated on the fringes of the outfit's world, who paid street tax on their criminal enterprises, and who should have known better than to target anything connected to the organization. The question that haunted investigators, both criminal and legal, was whether this had been an accident of ignorance or an act of deliberate provocation. Had these men truly not known whose house they were robbing, or had they believed that Accardo's advanced age and retirement status made him a safe target, someone whose bark had lost its bite? If it was the latter, if this had been a calculated test of his authority, then the response would need to be even more emphatic, a demonstration that would resonate throughout Chicago's criminal landscape and remind everyone that certain names, certain men, remained beyond reach regardless of circumstances. Accardo made his decision with the same cold rationality that had characterized his entire criminal career. There would be no negotiation, no opportunity for the burglars to return the stolen items and apologize, no clemency based on claims of ignorance or mistake. The violation demanded a response that would restore his reputation and reinforce the invisible boundaries that governed organized crime. Every thief, every low-level operator, every ambitious criminal needed to understand that crossing Tony Accardo meant death. Not eventual death, not possible death, but certain, inevitable, unavoidable death. The executions would be carried out with precision, and they would continue until every person connected to the burglary had been eliminated. The first body appeared on January 20th, 14 days after the burglary. Bernard "Buddy" Ryan was found behind the wheel of his Lincoln Continental, parked on a residential street on Chicago's southwest side. He had been shot multiple times at close range, the execution efficient and professional. There were no witnesses, no forensic evidence linking the killers to the scene, nothing that would allow law enforcement to build a prosecutable case. The message, however, was unmistakable to those who understood the language of mob violence. Ryan had been second in command of the burglary crew, a crucial player in the planning and execution. His death announced that the outfit knew who was responsible and that consequences were being administered. 3 days later, on January 23rd, Stephen Garcia was discovered in the trunk of a car abandoned in a South Side alley, his body bearing the marks of torture before the final gunshots ended his life. The escalation from simple execution to prolonged suffering indicated rage, a desire not just to kill, but to make the victim pay for his transgression in the most painful way possible. Garcia had been a talented burglar, known for his ability to bypass sophisticated security systems and work under pressure. Those skills had not saved him. Nothing could save him once the outfit had marked him for death. Then, on February 20th, came the discovery that sent shockwaves through Chicago's criminal community. John Mendell, the leader of the burglary crew, was found in the trunk of his Oldsmobile on the south side, his body bearing signs of extensive torture. Mendell had been a respected figure in the burglary world, someone whose judgment and planning had made him wealthy and whose reputation had protected him from most conflicts. That protection evaporated the moment he crossed Tony Accardo's threshold. The torture before his death was a deliberate choice, a statement that leadership carried no privilege when it came to outfit justice. If anything, being in charge of the operation that violated Accardo's home made the punishment more severe. But the killings did not stop with the core members of the burglary crew. The outfit's investigation had identified a wider network of accomplices, fences who might have been contacted about selling stolen goods, associates who had provided logistical support, even friends who had failed to warn the burglars about the danger they faced. Each represented a potential weak link, someone who might cooperate with law enforcement, or whose continued existence suggested that crossing the outfit carried manageable risks. Over the following weeks, the body count climbed. Some estimates place the number of murders connected to the River Forest burglary at 7 or 8. Others suggest the toll reached double digits when peripheral figures and suspected informants were included. The exact number remains uncertain because some bodies were never found, and some deaths were staged to look like unrelated criminal activity or accidents. What is certain is that the campaign of retribution was systematic, coordinated, and executed with an efficiency that demonstrated the outfit's organizational depth. Surveillance teams tracked targets. Safe houses were identified and raided. Potential escape routes were blocked. The burglars and their associates found themselves living in a nightmare where every stranger might be an assassin. Every car following them might contain killers, and every phone call might be the last they received before violence erupted. Some attempted to flee Chicago, believing that distance would provide protection. They discovered that the outfit's reach extended far beyond Illinois, that affiliations with East Coast families meant cooperation in tracking fugitives, and that geography offered no sanctuary when Tony Accardo wanted someone dead. Others went into hiding, moving between cheap motels and borrowed apartments, severing contact with family and friends in a desperate attempt to become invisible. But the criminal underworld is a small world, and anonymity is nearly impossible when informants are being pressured and rewards are being offered for information. One by one, the targets were located, cornered, and eliminated. Law enforcement watched this unfold with a mixture of frustration and grim fascination. Detectives understood what was happening, recognized the pattern of revenge killings, and could even identify likely targets based on known associates of the dead burglars. But understanding and proving are different things. The outfit's operations were compartmentalized, with orders passing through multiple layers of intermediaries before reaching the actual executioners. Witnesses were non-existent or too terrified to speak. Forensic evidence was minimal or deliberately contaminated, and the few informants who might have provided useful intelligence were themselves targets, aware that cooperating with police would only add their names to the death list. The FBI opened an investigation, recognizing that the scale and coordination of the killings suggested organized crime involvement. Agents interviewed known outfit members, conducted surveillance on suspected meeting locations, and attempted to flip low-level operatives who might provide testimony in exchange for witness protection. They achieved limited success. Most of those approached refused to cooperate, aware that no federal program could provide real safety from an organization as deeply rooted and far-reaching as the Chicago outfit. Those who did provide information offered only vague details, confirming what investigators already suspected without adding evidence that could lead to indictments. Tony Accardo himself was questioned, a formality that both sides understood would produce nothing of value. He met with federal agents in the presence of his attorney, answered questions with polite denials and claims of ignorance, and never wavered from his position that he was a retired businessman with no knowledge of criminal activity. His alibi for the time of the murders was unshakable. He had been in California, thousands of miles from Chicago, during the initial weeks of the killing spree. Later murders occurred while he was documented at family gatherings or medical appointments. The legal case against him was non-existent, not because investigators couldn't establish motive or opportunity, but because the structure he had built insulated him completely from direct culpability. The psychological impact of the retribution campaign extended far beyond the immediate victims. Throughout Chicago's criminal ecosystem, from high-level gambling operations to street-level theft rings, the message resonated with perfect clarity. The rules still applied. The hierarchy still held. And Tony Accardo, despite his age and official retirement, remained the most dangerous man in the city. Burglars who had never met Accardo, who operated in neighborhoods far from his influence, began verifying ownership before targeting homes, cross-referencing addresses against lists of protected properties and outfit-connected individuals. The cost of due diligence was minor compared to the cost of accidentally robbing the wrong house. Fences became more cautious about accepting merchandise, demanding provenance and assurances that stolen goods didn't originate from outfit-protected sources. Even legitimate businessmen who occasionally skirted legal boundaries found themselves more careful, aware that the invisible lines separating tolerated crime from fatal transgression were enforced with absolute prejudice. The families of the murdered burglars suffered in silence, denied even the comfort of public grieving. They could not demand justice through official channels without acknowledging their loved one's criminal activity. They could not seek revenge without inviting further violence upon themselves. They existed in a limbo of fear and grief, trapped between their knowledge of what had happened and their inability to do anything about it. Some left Chicago entirely, relocating to distant states where the outfit's influence was less pervasive. Others remained, living with the constant awareness that their proximity to the victims marked them as potential loose ends, problems that might someday require permanent solutions. Within the outfit itself, the campaign served multiple purposes beyond simple revenge. It was a demonstration of organizational capability, proof that the infrastructure Accardo had built over decades remained functional and lethal. Younger members observed how efficiently intelligence was gathered, how seamlessly orders were transmitted and executed, and how completely the organization could mobilize when leadership demanded action. It was an education in power, in the mechanics of fear, and in the enduring relevance of loyalty and obedience. The retribution also reinforced Accardo's position within the outfit's hierarchy. There had been quiet speculation among some younger, more ambitious members that the old man's retirement signified weakness, that his generation's leadership was obsolete in a changing criminal landscape. The River Forest response demolished that speculation. It proved that Accardo could still command absolute obedience, that his network of loyal operatives remained intact, and that challenging him, even indirectly, would result in consequences that were swift, severe, and inescapable. Any aspirations towards seizing power or restructuring the organization were postponed indefinitely. The message was clear. Tony Accardo would remain the ultimate authority until he chose otherwise. And anyone who forgot that lesson would face the same fate as John Mendell and his crew. The mechanics of the intelligence operation that identified and tracked the burglars revealed the sophistication of the outfit's infrastructure. Informants embedded in pawn shops and jewelry stores reported any attempts to sell items matching descriptions of what had been stolen. Surveillance teams, often using civilians who could blend into neighborhoods without attracting attention, tracked known associates of suspected burglars, documenting their routines and identifying safe houses. Wiretaps, illegal but ubiquitous in the criminal underworld, intercepted phone conversations that revealed locations and plans. And corrupted law enforcement officials, a resource the outfit had cultivated carefully over decades, provided access to police reports and investigative findings that helped confirm identities and movements. This network operated with the efficiency of a military organization, with intelligence flowing upward through layers of command until it reached decision-makers who determined targets and approved actions. The executioners themselves were specialists, men whose sole function within the outfit was carrying out killings with minimal risk of detection. They worked in teams, typically 2 or 3 individuals, who combined surveillance skills with violence capability. Their methods varied depending on circumstances. Some murders were straightforward shootings, quick and efficient, designed to eliminate targets with minimum exposure. Others involved abductions, transporting victims to secure locations where torture could be administered before execution. The bodies were then disposed of in ways calculated to send specific messages. Leaving a corpse in a trunk communicated one meaning. Abandoning it in a public location conveyed another, and causing a body to disappear entirely sent the most chilling message of all, that the outfit could erase someone from existence so completely that even confirmation of death became impossible. By the spring of 1978, the immediate wave of killings had largely concluded. The primary perpetrators of the burglary were dead, their close associates eliminated, and the peripheral figures who might have posed security risks neutralized. Tony Accardo returned to Chicago, resuming his routine of quiet domesticity and carefully managed public appearances. To outward observation, nothing about his demeanor suggested recent involvement in orchestrating multiple homicides. He attended family dinners, visited his physician for routine checkups, and spent afternoons at social clubs where old men played cards and discussed grandchildren. But those who knew him understood that beneath the veneer of elderly respectability remained a mind still sharp, still calculating, still absolutely ruthless when circumstances demanded. The River Forest burglary became a legend within Chicago's criminal community, a cautionary tale passed down through generations of gangsters and thieves. It was invoked in conversations about respect, about boundaries, and about the enduring nature of power. Remember what happened to Mendell became shorthand for explaining why certain rules must never violate, why certain names commanded deference regardless of changing times or generational transitions. Parents in mob families used the story to educate children about the importance of loyalty and the consequences of disrespect. And burglars approaching any home in certain Chicago neighborhoods would pause, verify ownership, and walk away if there was even a remote possibility of outfit connection. From a historical perspective, the incident illuminates several crucial aspects of organized crime in late 20th century America. First, it demonstrates the psychological rather than purely physical nature of mob power. Accardo's authority did not depend on his personal ability to commit violence. At 71, he was neither physically intimidating nor actively involved in daily criminal operations. His power derived from the infrastructure he controlled, the loyalties he commanded, and the certainty that his orders would be executed without question. This represents a mature stage in organized crime evolution, where leadership operates through institutional mechanisms rather than personal force. Second, the retribution campaign illustrates the economic logic underlying mob violence. The outfit's response was not purely emotional revenge, though emotional elements certainly existed. It was a rational business decision designed to protect the organization's long-term interests. Allowing the burglary to go unpunished would have invited further challenges, emboldened rivals, and suggested weakness that could have fractured the organization's control over its criminal territories. The cost of the revenge campaign, in terms of risk, resources, and potential law enforcement attention, was justified by the benefit of maintaining fear-based deterrence that protected the organization's operations. Third, the incident reveals the limitations of law enforcement against sophisticated organized crime. Despite knowing who was responsible, despite understanding the pattern of retribution, and despite having substantial resources and legal authority, federal and local law enforcement could not build prosecutable cases against the actual decision-makers. This wasn't due to investigator incompetence, but rather to the structural barriers that mature organized crime groups develop specifically to insulate leadership from legal consequences. The compartmentalization of information, the use of intermediaries, the cultivation of alibi witnesses, and the intimidation of potential informants created a system where proving criminal responsibility became nearly impossible despite moral certainty about guilt. The media coverage of the murders was surprisingly limited, reflecting both the challenges of reporting on organized crime and the climate of fear that surrounded outfit activities. Local newspapers published brief articles about individual homicides, noting the victims' criminal backgrounds and speculating about possible motives. But few journalists attempted comprehensive reporting that would connect the killings to the burglary and identify Accardo as the force behind the retribution. This reticence stemmed partly from libel concerns, the difficulty of proving allegations against powerful organized crime figures, and partly from legitimate fear. Reporters who delved too deeply into mob activities risked becoming targets themselves, and news organizations weighed the public interest value of such stories against the potential danger to their employees. The result was fragmented coverage that treated each murder as an isolated incident rather than part of a coordinated campaign, which served the outfit's interests by minimizing public understanding of the pattern and scale of the retribution. The burglary and its aftermath also had implications for Accardo's relationship with other organized crime families across the country. Leaders of the New York families, the Philadelphia mob, and other major organizations watched the Chicago situation carefully, drawing their own conclusions about the outfit's continued viability and Accardo's enduring influence. The efficiency and completeness of the response demonstrated that Chicago remained a formidable power in the national landscape of organized crime, capable of decisive action and unwilling to tolerate disrespect. This maintained Chicago's position in the complex web of interfamily relationships, territorial agreements, and cooperative ventures that characterized organized crime at the national level. Had Accardo failed to respond, or had the response been ineffective, it could have shifted power dynamics and encouraged encroachment on Chicago's traditional areas of influence. For the victims' families and associates who survived, the aftermath meant living with permanent fear and uncertainty. Some left the criminal world entirely, finding legitimate employment and trying to distance themselves from their past associations. Others remained involved in illegal activities but operated with heightened caution, acutely aware of boundaries and hierarchies. Many suffered psychological trauma, the kind of hypervigilance and anxiety that comes from knowing that violence could erupt at any moment without warning. Relationships fractured as survivors isolated themselves, avoiding contact that might draw attention or create vulnerabilities. Children grew up without fathers, wives became widows, and extended families bore the stigma of association with men who had crossed the deadliest organized crime figure in Chicago history. The economic impact on Chicago's criminal ecosystem was also significant. The burglary market contracted as thieves became more selective about targets, reducing the volume of stolen goods moving through fences and pawn shops. This had cascading effects on businesses that, while nominally legitimate, derived substantial income from handling stolen merchandise. Insurance companies saw claims decrease in certain categories, not because security had improved, but because thieves were avoiding properties that might have outfit protection. Labor racketeering operations, gambling networks, and loan sharking enterprises all continued functioning, but with heightened awareness of the need to respect organizational boundaries and hierarchies. Tony Accardo lived another 14 years after the River Forest burglary, dying of natural causes in 1992 at the age of 86. His longevity itself was remarkable in a profession where violent death was the norm, and his ability to avoid both assassination and significant prison time across nearly 8 decades of criminal activity represents an almost unique achievement in organized crime history. When he died, he was remembered in obituaries as a retired businessman and family man, with only oblique references to his criminal past. The full scope of his influence, the body count attributed to his orders, and the fear he generated throughout his life were sanitized for public consumption. But within the world he had dominated for so long, his legacy was clear. He had been the most successful mob boss in American history, measured not by flamboyance or public notoriety, but by longevity, influence, and the absolute authority he maintained from his rise in the Capone era through the dawn of the 1990s. The River Forest burglary and its bloody aftermath became the final defining chapter of that legacy, a demonstration that even in his 70s, even in retirement, even operating from thousands of miles away, Tony Accardo remained the most dangerous man in Chicago. The thieves who broke into his home paid for their transgression with their lives, and in doing so, they provided the ultimate confirmation of a truth that governed Chicago's underworld for half a century. There are men you simply do not cross, rules you simply do not violate, and consequences that, once set in motion, cannot be stopped, negotiated, or escaped. Today, the house on Franklin Avenue still stands, though it has changed hands multiple times since Accardo's ownership. New residents live there, unaware or perhaps deliberately ignorant of the history embedded in those walls, the violation that occurred one January night, and the wave of death it triggered. The neighborhood remains prosperous and quiet, the kind of place where children ride bicycles and neighbors chat over fences, where the distance from Chicago's violent history seems safely absolute. But for those who study organized crime, for those who understand the mechanisms of power and fear that governed the underworld, the River Forest burglary remains a case study in the psychology of retribution and the enduring nature of criminal authority. It teaches lessons about the importance of institutional knowledge in criminal organizations, about the ways power can be projected across distance and time, and about the terrible, inevitable consequences of challenging men whose entire lives have been built on the principle that respect, once lost, can only be restored through blood. The 8 or more men who died in the aftermath learned this lesson too late. Their lives ended by a system of vengeance that was methodical, inescapable, and absolutely merciless. Their story, tragic and brutal, serves as a permanent reminder that in the world Tony Accardo built and ruled, there were no second chances, no forgiveness, and no escape from justice delivered not by courts and law, but by the cold calculation of organized crime.